What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The South Carolina Gamecocks are up next. Before we look ahead to 2025, let's take a look back at what South Carolina did in 2024. Here were my projections and predictions last year for South Carolina. I was, pretty similar to my projection and prediction last year, going 6-6. So my projection for this South Carolina team was 6-6, and then my prediction for them was also 6-6. But South Carolina did much more better than that. They went 9-3 last year in the regular season. So I would say South Carolina wasn't a big surprise, but it's not really just based off of the record. It's what they really did on the field on both sides of the football. Yeah, I was not high on South Carolina. I really didn't have them coming close to being like a contender in the SEC. But if you look at the standings in the SEC and also the top 25 rankings in the playoff, this team actually was not really that far behind from making the first ever 12-team playoff. But yeah, they went 9-3 in the regular season, but 9-4 overall, so they did just miss out on a 10-win season under Shane Beamer for the first time ever. They went 9-4 if you count their bowl game loss to Illinois in the Cheez-It Bowl. So that's what they did last year according to my projection and predictions. Again, I was way off on South Carolina. Let's now look at the schedule from last season in 2024. And again, this was a very tough schedule last year. Probably one of the closest, hardest schedules in the SEC from this past season. But South Carolina was able to go 9-3. First off, you look at who they played in the non-conference. They played Old Dominion, Akron, Watford, and Clemson on the road. That Clemson game, of course, is a big one every year. They beat Clemson on the road in Death Valley for the second time in a row. This rivalry has been really close now. Ever since Shane Beamer got here, this rivalry has gone back and forth, and I think that's a disappointing loss for Clemson fans, especially losing at their own home place. But it was a big win for South Carolina, and with that win, they were really close to getting 10 wins at least, and they were not really that far away, like I said, making the college football playoff. Then you look at their SEC schedule. First off, you look at their home schedule. They played LSU, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, and Missouri, all at home in the SEC last year. They lost to LSU and Ole Miss both at home. They lost to LSU by 3 points. Had a pretty big chance there to pull off the upset. And if they would have won that game after beating Kentucky and Akron, they probably would have started the season off 4-0. But they got blown out by Ole Miss, but lost to Alabama by 2 points. Yeah, the LSU and Alabama games were both really close games for South Carolina. Very close to being upsets. And then you look at their road schedule. They actually play Kentucky on the road, Alabama, Oklahoma, Vanderbilt. That was where their road games in the SEC last year. Kentucky obviously was not even close. South Carolina won that big. Same thing with Oklahoma and Vanderbilt. Yeah, on the road last year, South Carolina really was good. Against Alabama, again, they lost that game by 2 points. They were really close to beating Alabama last year. So that's the schedule. Again, they were able to go 9-3 with this schedule for 2024. Let's now look ahead to 2025. This is their schedule coming up for the 2025 season. And before we go game by game, let's take a look at who South Carolina plays in the non-conference for this upcoming season. So this is your non-conference schedule for South Carolina. They will play Virginia Tech, of course. That game, of course, will be in Atlanta. That'll be the Sunday night before, or the Sunday later afternoon game. I think there's two games coming up on the Sunday before Labor Day. You got this game, and then you got Miami and Notre Dame. That's probably the Sunday night game before Labor Day, and then this game's probably in the later afternoon. I think it's probably around 4 o'clock somewhere Eastern time, somewhere in that time zone. But yeah, they will play Virginia Tech here. Interesting non-conference game, and again, that game is going to be in Atlanta. I feel like there will be more South Carolina fans here just because it's the SEC and everything, and most SEC teams play in Atlanta. But they'll also play South Carolina State, Coastal Carolina, and then Clemson. They play Clemson every year because of that rivalry, and again, last year they defeated the Tigers in Death Valley, of course. They won that game by 3. Should be another exciting game. This time it will be in South Carolina. And that does favor South Carolina here quite a bit. You beat Clemson last year, and then you get them at home. This non-conference schedule is a little bit tough when you got a couple of ACC teams in here. but it's not a tough non-conference schedule whatsoever. Let's now move on to the home SEC schedule for South Carolina. They'll play 4 home games in the SEC. They'll play Vanderbilt, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Alabama. So 3 out of these 4 opponents, you beat Vanderbilt, Kentucky, and Oklahoma. You beat all those teams on the road last year fairly easily, but you got Alabama here. That will be probably your toughest home game. They lost to Alabama by 2 last year. That's a game you like to have back if you're a South Carolina fan, and if you want to win that game, that's definitely going to be a big-time upset there if they were to somehow pull off the upset. I wouldn't be shocked here if South Carolina actually did pull off the upset, but that'll be a revenge game there for South Carolina, but this is not a bad home schedule. I repeat, it's not a bad home schedule for South Carolina. It really sets up well for them for 2025. Now, the away schedule is kind of tough, though, for South Carolina. Here is the away schedule. They will play 4 away games in the SEC. They'll play at Missouri, at LSU, at Ole Miss, and at Texas A&M. So just looking at this road schedule, it's very, very tough. Missouri is a winnable game, but that is on the road, of course, so that does favor the Tigers just a little bit. LSU, Ole Miss, and Texas A&M, though, these are all very talented teams, and these are all very tough places to play, especially LSU in Death Valley. Ole Miss, of course, on the road is always a pretty tough place to play. And then, obviously, you have to go to Kyle Field in College Station to play Texas A&M, and that, of course, will probably be a raucous crowd because Texas A&M lost to South Carolina last year, and that was not even a close game. So that's your away schedule. It's definitely tougher than the home schedule and definitely tougher than the non-conference schedule. Let's now go back to the schedule here for South Carolina and go game by game now for the Gamecocks. Again, they'll play Virginia Tech here on this Sunday later afternoon before Labor Day. Again, I'm assuming it's an afternoon game here in this one on August 31st. This game, of course, will be in Atlanta. Then they'll play South Carolina State on September the 6th. Then they open up SEC play at home against Vanderbilt on September 13th. Then they'll go on the road to play Missouri on September 20th. Then they play Kentucky after that on September 27th. That'll be a home game there for South Carolina. And then their first bye week becomes right here before playing LSU on the road on October the 11th. That's actually a pretty good spot for a bye week, in my opinion, if you're a South Carolina fan, before playing a very tough game on the road at LSU. And then after that, it's Oklahoma at home on October 18th. Then they play that big game against Alabama on October 25th. Then in the month of November, they go on the road to play Ole Miss on November 1st. Then they also play on the road at Texas A&M on November 15th. So you got back-to-back road games there with Ole Miss and Texas A&M. But the good news is you get a bye week in between them. You get a bye week before playing Texas A&M. I think that's a pretty good spot for a bye week as well. So you get 2 bye weeks that are pretty well set up for South Carolina, right before playing LSU in Death Valley, and then right before playing Texas A&M on the road in Kyle Field. Then after that, you play Coastal Carolina on November 22nd. And then they close things out with the rivalry against Clemson on November 29th, and that'll also be a home game there for South Carolina. So that's the schedule for South Carolina for 2025. It's another pretty tough schedule. Of course, every year, South Carolina seems like they have a very tough schedule. Let's now get to the projection here for South Carolina. This is the scale I'll be using here for their projection, and like I said, if it's a 1% game in the red, pretty much that's counted as an automatic loss in that percentage, but I don't think there's going to be a lot of games where South Carolina will be a big underdog in by more than 3 touchdowns. Most of these games could be 50-50 games, and some of them they'll probably be favored, but maybe some of these games, maybe that will have, some of these games will be underdogs in, but we'll get to that in just a moment. 20% games in the orange, though, those are games where South Carolina will be a double-digit underdog by a couple of touchdowns, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. And then your 40% games in the yellow, those are games where South Carolina will be a clear underdog in by about a touchdown, about 6 or 7 points, somewhere in that point range. Your 50-50 games, like I talked about, it will stay in the white, games that really can go either way. Your 60% games in the purple, those are games where South Carolina is going to be favored by about a touchdown, 6 or 7 points, somewhere in that particular range. Then your 80% games in the blue, those are pretty much games where South Carolina will be favored by double digits, 10 to 14 points. And then your automatic wins are your green games, in this percentage at 99%. So we start with the easy wins here for South Carolina in that percentage, the automatic wins. I think you got a couple of them, South Carolina State and Coastal Carolina. South Carolina State definitely probably over that 95 to 99% mark. South Carolina State made the FCS playoffs last year, but really, I don't really study the FCS all that much, and South Carolina State probably is not going to be a team that's going to pull off a huge upset out of nowhere, but Coastal Carolina could be a little bit tricky. You know, Coastal Carolina used to be a pretty good team at the Group of 5 level. I don't really know if they're the same as they used to be, but that'll be a pretty tough game there. Maybe it's probably at that 90% mark, but I think South Carolina either way will be favored by 17 or 20 plus points. And both of these games are not guaranteed wins, but they're counted as wins here in this projection automatically. And I got to be honest, I don't have any blue games on here for South Carolina. Will they be favored by double digits? There's just not a single game on here where I think South Carolina is going to be favored by double digits. But there are some purple games on here where I think South Carolina will be favored by 6 or 7 points, so by about a touchdown somewhere in that particular range. And I got 3 of them, and that's Vanderbilt, Kentucky, and Oklahoma. All 3 of these games are at home. That's the reason why they fall in the purple. You can make an argument that, you know, all 3 of these games probably should be in the blue. Maybe Kentucky probably should be in the blue, but I think Kentucky and South Carolina, when it comes to that matchup, I know last year's game was not really close. That's obviously a very tough game to predict and also to project every single year, but South Carolina is playing at home. That's the reason why it falls in the purple. Same thing with Vanderbilt and Oklahoma. And all 3 of these teams that South Carolina played last year in the purple, these are all games that were not really close. So that's the reason why they also fall in the purple. So these 3 games, I think South Carolina will be favored in all 3 of them by 6 or 7 points, so by about a touchdown, again, somewhere in that particular range. And then I look at the rest of the schedule here. I don't think South Carolina will be an underdog in any of these games. I think these are all 50-50 games. I know there's a lot of 50-50 games, like 7 total 50-50 games. Virginia Tech and Atlanta, that's the reason why it's a 50-50 game. It's because it's on a neutral site field. Missouri is a pretty even matchup. LSU, I think LSU is definitely the more talented team, but based off of last year when, you know, all the teams finishing and also based off of, this game being close, that's the reason why it turned into a 50-50 game. Same thing for Alabama. I know Ole Miss's game was not really close last year either, but I just think that's a pretty even matchup. I think Ole Miss is a little bit more talented, but just based off of the tier system I use, that's a 50-50 game in my opinion. Texas A&M, South Carolina beat them pretty easily last year. Texas A&M might be favored by less than a field goal. And then obviously Clemson. That's a rivalry game that really can go either way. We saw it go either way last year. Even though South Carolina beat Clemson, South Carolina probably could be favored. You never know, but I think all 7 of these games can really go either way. So yeah, 7 50-50 games. That's the most 50-50 games I have had in all these projections that I've done so far for every single team out of all the Power 4 teams. So what does the projected record come out to be here for South Carolina based on how tough this schedule is? Well, we count a couple of those green games as wins, and then you average out the purple games at 60%. Same thing for the 50-50 games at 50%. And let's say they split these 50-50 games. Let's say they win 4 out of the 7 50-50 games, but then they probably slip up in one of these purple games. You lose 3 more 50-50 games. So yeah, you win 4 50-50 games. That'll give you 4 more wins, including those green games. And then you got 3 50-50 wins, and then you probably slip up, actually I should say you lose 3 50-50 games, and then you probably slip up in one of these purple games. I mean, they could lose to either one of these teams, Vanderbilt, Kentucky, or Oklahoma. I think Oklahoma is probably that team that maybe could upset them, but you never know who it could be. So with that being said, you lose 3 50-50 games, and then you slip up in one of these purple games. That'll give you 4 losses, and that does give you 4 out of the 8 games. So with that being said, the projected record for South Carolina is 8-4. So again, if you split these 50-50 games, you win 4 out of the 7 50-50 games, but then you lose 3 more 50-50 games, and then you slip up in one of these purple games, either Vanderbilt, Kentucky, or Oklahoma. That's going to give you a 4th loss somewhere in those purple games. So that's the reason why the projected record came out to be 8-4 here for South Carolina. But I just tell you what, looking at the schedule, it's pretty tough. They can probably go 7-5. I think that's the worst case scenario. And then best case is probably 9-3 again, like they did from last year. But yeah, South Carolina 8-4 is what the projected record looks like as of right now for 2025. Do you guys agree or disagree? Let me know down in the comments below. below, and also give me your thoughts about South Carolina's schedule down in the comments below as well. Is it tough or not so tough? Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.